Now I'm very excited to welcome back an analytics and bracket specialist to the Oddsbreakers and Mr. Erik Haslam from HaslamMetrics.com. You can follow him on Twitter at HaslamMetrics. Erik, man, we are back. Conference season has started. College football's ending, so that means we switched to college basketball. How the heck you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's that time of season where pro football's still hanging around, but college football's done. So yeah, we're shifting. The casual college basketball fans are starting to get some interest. Usually they kind of stay away in November and December, but now we hit January, we hit February, it starts ramping up. And, 2 months from now, we'll be talking about, bracketology, getting ready for March Madness already.
Yeah, I can't believe it. It does creep up on you. And the NFL is extending themselves a little bit, with the 17th game, and now the Super Bowl's in mid-February. But college football's over, and this is what I do on my Saturdays and weeknights now is I watch college basketball. And you've been, it's so funny. It's like I feel like we're starting, but to be honest with you, I've been following you since early November, late October, tweeting about it. So you get right into it immediately and stuff. But that's wonderful, and it's nice to get a big joke on it. But before we talk about just hoops in general, is there any changes from last year to the Haslam Metrics site? Any tweaks that you had to make, or any new surprises?
Yeah, nothing really. When it comes to the site itself, I wouldn't say that anything was really changed. I, every so often toss back some ideas in my head back and forth about adding some different, metrics, new things, new categories, things that I could display out there. But I kind of never get around to doing it just because I have to go back and fill in all the stuff from the past like 10 seasons as well. So I didn't really make a lot of changes to the site. As far as the algorithm goes, I made a little tweak here and there. I know one of them involved the early analytical finals. As you know, my data is really, or I should say my ratings are very much dependent on transitive comparisons. And you have weird situations where you have different performance teams performing differently against the same opponent. And sometimes you may have a game go right down to the wire, and then you have somebody else plays the same team and they win that game. They're up by 37 with 19 minutes to play in the second half. And the question is, how do you compare those two performances, especially when one is such a fraction of a game and the other is a full game, and so in some of those situations where you have early analytical finals, I try to kind of de-weight that big performance, that overwhelming performance, because the efficiency numbers can be blown out of proportion. They're legit numbers. They actually happened, but they're just not indicative of I think of the true nature of that team, either team, the team that lost and the team that won. So
it's not good to use them for prediction a lot. I understand what you're saying, because it's almost like the Dallas Cowboys at home against a bad team. They blow them out, and it doesn't mean they're going to beat a good team. It's just the way sometimes they play, and it's just the way the crowd influences the bad team. I mean, I feel like they in football have a higher home field advantage than others. I think I think that's what you're kind of getting at. It's hard to use that as a predictor if that's not going to happen all the time, and especially when they're in a different situation, right?
Yeah, when you hit that if you're hitting an early analytically final, and you're the winning team, you're playing your best basketball in, say, the first 25 minutes of the game. But is that how do you compare that with the team that played its best 25 minutes equivalently as good in the last 25 minutes? So it's kind of a difficult way. The transitive comparisons are a little bit tricky that way, and so I de-weighted some of the early analytically finals. I ended up just kind of and I may de-weight it some more, and I just got to look at it a little bit more. Other stuff, I like I said, ideas jump back and forth in my mind. I may make some tweaks here and there, or some adjustments for efficiency and pace in the preseason next year. I'm looking at that. And then the consistency metric is something I'm probably going to change. Right now I'm using standard deviation. Standard deviation can be a little bit problematic, and I'll cite an example for you, is that Kansas is probably one of the more consistent teams, but standard deviation identifies it as an inconsistent team, largely because they had the biggest deviation from the expectation of any team in the season. Their opening game against NC Central, which blew the expectation out of the water. So what I may end up doing is I may switch over to something called IQR, which is interquartile range, or maybe a hybrid of the two ways of evaluating consistency, just to try to kind of minimize that outlier that you're going to see there with what happened in that opening game for Kansas.
I gotcha. So that's really interesting, and probably just a lot to think about. And then, like you always say, we want to dig the grave too deep. We just want to keep it 6 feet down. And you always run into that issue too. But I totally get it, man. I'm just looking at Kansas here. I'm kind of surprised they're only 29th in the ratings right now.
Yeah, for me, that's interesting. I mean, if you look at what they've done, there's no denying the teams that they've beaten. But I think the problem, and you can look at their record quality, and that's on my site. One of the metrics that I offer out there is record quality, and they're 4th in the country in record quality, which makes complete sense considering they beat Kentucky, they beat Tennessee, they beat UConn. And people can say, well, why is that the case? Why are they not showing up higher in the ratings? Well, the reason why is they kind of deliver lackluster results against lesser opposition. So this is probably a team that's going to play up to the level of their competition, and also play down to the level of their competition. So if you look at the ratings on, you're showing it right there, you can see those game ratings on the far right side, and everything is pretty close to the expectation for a team that's ranked number 29, with the exception of that NC Central game, which was ridiculous, a plus 95.6, which I believe is tops for any team this season. But other than that, you look at it, go, they beat Missouri, who is, really fallen off this year. They beat them by 9, unimpressively. At Indiana, they win that game by 4. Even the Yale win, in the Wichita State games. I mean, those were a little bit better, but Eastern Illinois beating them by 8, that's a black eye on when you're trying to evaluate them from a metric standpoint. And you can say, well, that's an outlier too. But the argument can be made like, oh, that's an outlier, but you can't really do that. And that's what I tell people and say, when it comes to the analytics, you can't just arbitrarily, subjectively say, well, I'm going to cherry pick these 3 games, UConn and Marquette and Kentucky, because they make Kansas look better. You have to, as I always say, Tebow, the entire body of work. You have to evaluate the entire body of work. And people can say, well, look at them, what they've done against great opposition, and say, yeah, but the analytics don't know Duquesne from Duke from Drexel.
Right.
So
right.
It's trying to figure this out on the fly. So if it looks and says, well, this is a team that beat Eastern Illinois by 8 at home, that's not a very good performance. And it sees other performances like that as well. So, over time, early on, I'm not surprised to see Kansas not doing that well in the ratings now, but as time goes along and you start playing teams like TCU and Oklahoma State and Cincinnati and Iowa State, those are the games coming up in January for them. If they start thumping some of these teams in the Big 12, the metrics are going to catch on pretty quick.
Oh, absolutely. And I totally get it. I mean, Indiana's been a bad team getting blown up on Nebraska too. It's like they're 101th ranking and they only win by 4 points. Indiana's not what they should be. And so that's why they're ranked lower than on some of the other sites that are out there right now. And I totally get that. But it's interesting. It makes me think of a new metric, and it's like, what can you name it? Like a metric that says, look, they play down to their competition and they play up to their competition, something that it's consistency involved, but a little different. Yeah, right.
I have one. I have one. It's called the paper tiger factor. And I've tinkered with the idea of throwing it out there at some point. It's really hard to say because you're saying playing up to the level of their opponent or down, and then up and down is so subjective. If you're the 362nd ranked team in the country, everything is up. How do you do that? So
right. If you're looking at it from their perspective,
right.
I guess it would be a certain level of going up. Is the only way you'd look at it. But yeah, I would say maybe they only apply to teams that it may be quadrants. You put them in quadrants, like if Kansas is, or if UConn's playing a team in the top 20, they're playing up, even though they're in the top 20. But if they're playing someone in the 100 to 150, they're massively playing down, and anything lower, that's even farther massive. But that's just food for thought, right? We're tinkering.
Yeah, that's something. And I throw that out there. I throw thrown that out there the last few years, and I probably will here in the next month. One day I'll say I want to take a look at the paper tiger factor, kind of rate the teams that play against, better against great competition, the teams that play better against worse competition. And I've done that in the past, and I'll probably throw something like that out there could be even the next week. It just depends on when I decide to run the query and throw it out there.
Absolutely loving it, man. Well, let's move on to the next question that I've written down, and that is about the biggest challenges. Running a site. I noticed maybe a couple weeks ago your site was down. You tweeted about it. You're pissed. When my site goes down, I get pissed. I'm like, what the hell? There's nothing I can do. I feel terrible. That must be one of the challenges. But besides that, what are some of the other challenges running a site like yours?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is probably, you have to prepare yourself for the format changes of your sources. So, years ago, I looked into getting an official source that I could actually get the data from where they provide it and I pay a service. Well, if you go to Stats LLC, they quoted me 5 figures per year out of the gates. And I don't know what 5 figures mean, because that could be anything from $10,000 to $99,999. I have no idea, but I don't exactly just have 5 figures of money sitting in the corner waiting to be spent. I've a kid
for officiating data. Did you say officiating?
No,
data?
I mean just statistics data, like Stats LLC.
Oh, so getting more data,
play-by-play logs, things like that, box score logs, getting the official delivery of that data from a bona fide source. And so because you can't really do that, you have to go out there and find the data yourself. And there are sites out there, obviously, everybody knows them, where they can show box score data, they show play-by-play data. And if you have access to that, you can write scripts to pull that information in. The problem with doing that is those sites at any time can change their format. And if they change the format and the scripts that you write are pulling the data, all of a sudden can't read it, everything kind of blows up. And that happens once every year, once every couple of years. When it does, it's like, oh God, all right, I got to fix this. And it takes me a few hours to fix it. And then and it may get to a point where I can't even read it anymore. If that happens, I got to throw my hands up and go, okay, this is a sign from God. I got to find another source or do it another way. Could get tricky, but like I said, I hope that doesn't happen during the college basketball season. But you're still at the mercy of those sites. I'd also say you're kind of at the mercy of the scorekeepers. One of the things that kept me up late last night was me coming across how the play-by-play logs were handled for a few games. I noticed, and I had to make some coding changes because, for example, they changed the clock times in a play-by-play log for the Wisconsin-Iowa game. And while the guy was at the line shooting 2 free throws, his first free throw was at 9:39 remaining. The second free throw was at 9:37. Well, obviously the clock was not running, so the guy was entering it wrong. But
error. Yep.
But the way you have to handle things, it gets very tricky how to handle those play-by-play logs if you want that rich data to be brought in. So that's another challenge. And then I think the other real challenge just right now, just at my phase of my life being, I'm going to be 50 next October, just is the need to remain informed on the game versus the time element with the family commitments and the responsibilities like that. So, one of the things I see nowadays is so many people out there, it's kind of an arms race of these 20 somethings and 30 somethings who are, I watched 13 hours of basketball on Saturday and another 7 on Sunday, and I'm going to visited 12 different games this month and things like that. And I look at it and go, I just came to the realization I'm just getting too old for that kind of stuff. I just don't have that. I really came to the realization that I'm going to do what I do, but you know what? My best friend are those 8-minute videos on YouTube. And I can say, like last night, for example, I play volleyball. I play competitive volleyball still at the age of 49. I was, just prepping for that, driving there, playing the game for an hour, coming back home, showering afterwards, and then settling down and doing other things, helping my kid, prepare for a spelling bee today. All these different things come up. I didn't watch a single minute of basketball yesterday, not a single minute. But then I try to catch up, and that's why I said these 8-minute and 13-minute videos on YouTube are probably going to give you what you want the best you can. Now, if I get a few hours to myself, as I did tonight, watching this blowout between Arizona and Colorado, and then it switched over little Michigan and Minnesota, I'll take advantage. But boy, that's a challenge as well. Just the need to remain informed on the game if you're going to be kind of a quote unquote expert versus the time element once you hit the age of 49.
Yeah, I mean, that is massive, but at least for the games you miss, this gets the data anyway, and you can
Yep.
see kind of what happened and just look at a box score without having to look at a ton of videos. And sometimes we all have to deal with that, and my age too. I'm not far behind you. I know what you're feeling, my man. Those are some real challenges that you come across,
Yeah.
but we love that you're doing it because we love your site. When does preseason expectations completely expire from the metrics on your site?
Yeah, that's usually right around Christmas for me. It depends on the number of opponents and the number of transitive comparisons there are behind the scenes that come out of those results. And like I've always said, I think it's usually usually the shortest day of the year, right around December 21st, but it's not across the board. You're going to see it kind of filter off. So I think I posted back in November and December at one point that I think Eastern Kentucky had shed the minimum amount of its preseason weighting. It was 56%, while I think the highest was 92 at the time. And by now, I haven't checked it. I'm guessing they've all shed their preseason ratings. It's completely gone. Another thing I'm just kind of tinkering with, do I want to potentially extend the influence of the preseason baselines a little bit more? I haven't in the past, but I'm open to it. I'm looking at some options in the weighting to see if I want to hold on to that a little bit longer. But, I almost prefer to kind of drop the preseason baselines early because it's so subjective. I mean, you pick your own variables and then you create your own linear model for your preseason baselines. And it's got some accuracy to it, but I just prefer to rely on those transitive comparisons, the real life data. And I think that's what kind of really gives the site the intrigue that it offers. And so whereas I may think of, kind of pushing that down the road a little bit, maybe holding on to those preseason baselines, I doubt I will. I'll probably just, keep it as is, I'm guessing at this point.
Yeah, so interesting. BYU going up to number one,
Yeah.
and they're in the top 80 or something like that, 70, 80 from the start of your metrics.
Yeah.
But you look on some other sites, Ken Palms, BYU's number 4, so they're kind of catching up anyway. What's interesting is that they're just massively blowing out bad teams. The only top 50 team they played was San Diego State in Utah. So I find that just so interesting that you wonder when they really step up in this Pac-12 or not Pac-12 schedule, but the Big 12 conference schedule, how that's really going to kind of come to fruition.
Yeah, it's and that's the challenge with the analytics is you can't ignore those results. They're still doing, like you said, they're blowing these teams out. Yeah. They're behaving like an elite team would against that type of opposition. But like we talked about before, there's teams out there that just fold like a cheap suit when they meet real opposition. And, we're going to see pretty soon. And I can identify 3 Big 12 teams, BYU, Oklahoma, and Iowa State. All 3 of them, we're going to find out pretty soon what they're made of. Because like I said about BYU, BYU, they're going to face, I think I said that looking at my own rankings, I think they've faced 2 top 75 teams in their first 13 15 games or whatever like that. And you mentioned them, San Diego State and Utah. Their entire month of January is nothing but top 60 top 61 teams.
Your
entire month. So we'll find out soon enough.
It's going to be so interesting and so fun to watch because a lot of these sites go by these metrics, and if they're not really going to step up as an away team against a good defense, then that's something to fade. They have a very good home court advantage. That's going to be factored into the lines anyway in many cases too. So it's almost like that away situation is probably what bettors are going to at least look at, but then the market catches up and that can be a little juiced in itself too. So I love how you mentioned Iowa State there too, because we don't know what they're going to do. Started out very well. 11-2, very high in most ratings as well, but they're a fun team to watch too. And
strength of schedule with those 3. I mentioned this earlier with a buddy on a radio show with my buddy. I rate strength of schedule 256th strength of schedule for BYU, Oklahoma 285, Iowa State 325. So a lot of cupcakes on these non-conference schedules for those 3 teams.
Exactly. They did beat A&M, but A&M has been beat up too. So we'll see how that. Oh no, they lost A&M. They should have. They should have won from the way they shot in your match. Should have matched.
Yeah, Iowa State had the loss to Virginia Tech too, and I don't think Virginia Tech's a bad team. Oklahoma, we talked about them a little bit. They have their one loss, which was on a neutral court to North Carolina, very understandable. And then they have the win against Providence. Their number between 50 and 60 for me, but of those three teams, the really the only good win in there, I'd say those three teams right now is BYU beating San Diego State. That's probably it.
That's so true. Absolutely. And yeah, and I was just looking at Iowa State here. They do face Oklahoma very shortly here on Saturday. So that's going to be a fun one to look at here.
Yeah.
See who's really overrated and who's not.
Right.
Oh man, that's going to be fun. No, let's get into the next question here I have. And looking at the top 4 teams of all time, who is your top 4 of all time?
So when I got this question, I kind of thought, I didn't know if we're talking historically from an opinion standpoint or if we're looking at just the Haslam metric stuff.
The Haslam metrics.
All right. So if that's the case, then I started back in 2014 and 2015. So I kind of went back and I actually crunched the numbers, looked at efficiency margin to calculate the answer here. So do you want to take a stab at who do you think number 1 is?
Is it the Kentucky of 2015?
It is Kentucky of 2015 with Aaron and Andrew Harrison and Karl Anthony Towns and Devin Booker. Yep, that would be number 1. You want to let's see if he can knock out another. Let's see if he can get the next one.
Oh God, this is going to be tough.
Throw a few out.
Okay, I'm going to go with the 2022 Gonzaga team.
Oh, you were close. To 2021 Gonzaga.
Okay. 2021 Gonzaga.
That's their second. That's a team with Suggs and Timmy and Kispert. So they were second. So I'll give you credit for that one.
All right. Man, I'm gonna have to cheat and go to the site.
I can tell you. If you don't want to guess, I can tell you the last 2.
I'm gonna guess. Maybe was Baylor one of them or no?
Baylor was close. It was. I think they were in the top 6 or 7, but I don't think they weren't.
Okay, and Nova from 2018.
Yep, Nova from 18 was 3. That's the team with Jalen Brunson.
Okay, and then you give me the last one.
Going back to 15, that should give you the clue.
Oh, the Badgers.
Badgers, yeah.
Really? Okay. Yeah, they were up there too
with Kaminsky and Decker.
My favorite team ever.
They were great. And the only team to give Kentucky a loss that year.
Yeah, and then the poor officiating in the Duke game. Yeah, I don't even want to get into that.
Painful.
I have watched it again, and it is worse than you even think. So how much does strength of schedule factor into these numbers? I should ask.
It's a hard question to answer because we have a strength of schedule metric, but I don't factor that in anywhere. Like I said, transitive comparisons come in, and as time goes along, the analytics form these expectations. I throw them out there on a daily basis on X, and I say that these are the daily projections or the daily forecasts. But really what they are is expectations. Is like, if you're going to retain your ranking, this is the expectation of what's supposed to happen in this game. And that gets formed by all these transitive comparisons behind the scenes. So this is where I always kind of like say, if you want to walk with the big dogs and want to piss with the big dogs, you got to lift your leg high. So now is the time for BYU to do that. So, BYU going out there and, taking, if they're playing on a neutral court against Kansas, BYU is going to be favored by a few points. And people would look at that and go, wow, that's a lot to ask of BYU. Hey, they've shown every sign that that's the team they are based on who they've beaten so far. But now they have to meet that expectation if they want to retain their spot. And this is where a team like Kansas, likewise, right now may not have impressed, may have had some lackluster games, but the moment they go out there and start bashing Texas and they start bashing Texas Tech and they start bashing Oklahoma, they're going to climb very, very quickly. And the opposite goes for those other teams like Oklahoma. If Oklahoma's up there at the top and all of a sudden they start losing games by 20 to the likes of Kansas or Baylor, they're going to fall pretty quickly.
Yeah, I kind of remember, I think it was Indiana only had 2 losses in the early season 2022, and then they went to the Big Ten schedule and just got obliterated. It's just you think they're a lot better than they are, and I'm not saying BYU is them, but we're going to find out. And I think that's the fun thing. And then sports bettors, this is what you are studying. You're trying to find out if they really do falter when it comes to big competition. So I find that interesting. I think it's going to be a little rough for them, and I kind of think that I think they will find a stride again, though. I think it's going to.
Yeah, I mean,
be like that. They'll grow up a little bit through it.
And this is why I think you always have to use a balance of the eye test and the analytics, because your eyes tell you exactly who these teams are as far as what their ceiling is. BYU, Colorado State, Oklahoma probably don't have that high of a ceiling, but they've made the most of their talent, sometimes and exceeded expectations. So I always like to look at it like this and say, BYU, here's BYU's ceiling, here's Kansas's ceiling. Mm-hmm. But where has BYU played right now? Probably right about here. Kansas may have played right about here. But they have so much untapped potential from here to here that they are going to probably tap into that. We've seen this time and time again where teams kind of don't gel so great in November and December. And then all of a sudden they put it all together and they reach that ceiling. Whereas BYU, as good as they've been, are they maximizing? Are they all they can possibly be at this point? And they have nowhere else to go but down. I guess, again, that's what makes it fun. Because right now, the analysts are just reviewing what they've done so far this season, but they're not looking forward and saying, oh, I think Kansas has a higher ceiling, so I'm going to bump them up.
That's a great point, too. Yeah, it's level of talent people have to factor in, too, and sometimes they do that just in football and other sports. Like this team's going to show better, even though they have had their hiccups and have messed up against teams they should have blown out, but they have the talent to do it. This team is just playing a little bit more out of their minds and they're a little well coached. It's always the fun thing to talk about talent versus the coaching and the guys with big motors. It's talent usually wins in these situations, but that's just the whole fun about college basketball. I was going to ask your top four. I see BYU, Houston, Purdue, and Arizona. I think it's interesting to talk about Houston because now Houston, like BYU, is the other team in the Big 12. And now their schedule is going to be way harder than it was with the American Athletic Conference because they were just facing Memphis before, right? It was them and maybe a couple others, but it was mostly, the situation where they would get a cakewalk until the big dance happens. And now they got to play teams like Iowa State, at BYU, TCU, Texas, Kansas, multiple times, Baylor. You throw Cincinnati in there. I don't know how Cincinnati's ranked 34 now. I guess they're doing pretty well, but yeah, I think Houston's going to be scathed. I think I said on one of your tweets, I was surprised how quickly the undefeated teams dropped out this year.
Yeah, with Houston, it's going to be very interesting to see defensively. I mean, they're playing in an otherworldly level right now defensively. Is that going to continue? I don't know, but I mean, boy, that is their calling card this year. I don't know. There's people out there saying this is the best defensive team in the last 10 years, and you're talking about Virginia as well in there. Yeah. But again, we haven't really seen the Big 12 schedule yet. Once we get going on that, and they start facing Kansas, and we start facing Baylor, teams that can light it up on occasion, it would be it's going to be great. I think is there a game coming up pretty soon? I thought I was looking at this the other. BYU and Baylor. That's coming up next Tuesday night. I kind of wish it was BYU and Houston. That would be really but BYU and Baylor is going to be interesting. I'm going to be interested to see if Baylor's athleticism is going to be problematic for the Cougars outside shooting. That's kind of what I want to see. But at the same time, Houston plays Iowa State in Ames on Tuesday night as well. So that's going to be, Iowa State, are they a paper tiger? Are they going to fold when they meet real opposition? Well, Houston is real opposition. I want to see how well Iowa State scores in that game if they even reach 50 points against Houston, because, boy, that defense is for real, in my opinion.
Great point. Let's talk about one thing before we get into a few games, and it's your should versus your did, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I might as well stay in Houston here. For example, they beat Jackson State 82-48, but they should have won 89-55. I guess you're just moving the score up a little bit. The Texas A&M, I found it interesting because they should have won 69-61, but they won 70-66, a much closer game. How do you factor in should or calculate should compared to what they actually did?
Yeah. So one of the differences there, so should is that expectation we talked about, which is based on the fingerprint.
Oh, your predicted score beforehand.
Yeah. The should is the expectation. And that will change on a daily basis. You'll see as you go back, as that team moves in the rankings, the previous shoulds will also update. So basically, you're looking at a team right now. Houston is number 2 in the country. For a team with Houston's fingerprint, today's fingerprint, those are the scores that are in line with a team that is number 2 with that kind of fingerprint. That's the expectation. And then the did is what actually happened. Now, the difference in the rating and the efficiency ratings are not going to always match the did. And let me explain that. The efficiency ratings are going to go up to the analytically final. The did is going to be the final score. And I could, if I had data, play-by-play log data for every single game, which I probably have for most games, but I don't have it for everything. If I had it for everything, I could probably list there and say, hey, this particular game went analytically final at the 419 mark with this team leading by 22 with this score. And so those efficiency numbers that you see there, those are based on the analytically final. The did column is just the final score. So you sometimes might scratch your head and go, well, that's weird because they didn't meet the expectation, but the rating on the far right side gives them a very high score. The reason that will probably happen is in situations where, say, a team built a 25-point lead, the game went analytically final, and then the final score was like a 12-point win, where the losing team came back, outscored the other team by 13 down the stretch when in garbage time. But at that point, I've taken all that data out. So you'll see the analytically final numbers on the right side, but you won't see it in the did column.
Gotcha. So basically, the did column shows what they actually did. The should column is not necessarily is what they did from the point you stopped it with the analytically final and adding the rest of the time in the game, right?
Remember, the should is just the expectation if they played full bore for 40 minutes, what should happen. The did is the final score, and then everything on the right side, the efficiency numbers are all based on performance of that game before it went analytically final.
Okay, so basically, if should was lower than what they did, then the rating would be actually higher because the rating would go up higher or lower.
Yeah. So if you should win by 8 and you do win by 21, you're going to probably see a positive score on the far right column.
A positive score in the rating, right?
Yep, correct.
And it will it match the should minus did kind of in a way, or this is just their efficiency rating going up and down, right?
That's just efficient. Yeah. Again, that's okay. So all that is there's an expectation, and we break that down for the efficiencies as well. And everything is adjusted for home court advantage before I show the numbers here. So you'll see, like, for example, if a team is playing, at Wisconsin and then they host Wisconsin, you'll see the should numbers are going to be the same. The reason for that is I've adjusted all these efficiency numbers beforehand. So those are not the raw efficiency numbers. So the did efficiency numbers there that I talked about, that have to do with before analytically final, those have been adjusted to remove the home court advantages or add them in one way. Yeah, depending on where the game was played.
Okay, makes sense. And then so this rating are these percentage changes? Because obviously they've been in the top 6 the whole time. If you go up 15.28.
So if you look at adjusted offensive efficiency and adjusted defensive efficiency, it's just a sum of the difference columns from those two. So if you look at, and so that gives you a game rating. And so then you can sort that game rating, and that is a nice way, an objective way of kind of saying, what was the best performance of this team this season? And it kind of, and what you're saying is, a lot of people would say, well, your best performance is going to be when you beat the best team. Well, no, I don't look at it that way. I kind of say you're playing this team, so you have an expectation. How far above or below that line did you go? And that's the rating, the game rating. So that's how I like to look at it and say that's their best game of the season, because they had an expectation here. They are their biggest difference from deviation, as I call deviation from the expectation, is here. That's their best game. Their biggest deviation from the expectation below is here. That's their worst performance.
Totally makes sense. And that's why, obviously, when teams like BYU are massively blowing out their competition, they're even because the rating keeps going up so high, they're moving up in the rankings a lot quicker.
Correct. And that's what you're going to see more often than not. When you have a game that comes back and you have a positive game rating, you're probably going to climb in my rankings. If you're negative, you're probably going to drop. That's not all the way through, for example, because other stuff is going on at the same time. So you may have a slightly positive performance where 3 teams beneath you both had great performances and they jumped you. So all of a sudden, people look, well, I'm 32 and I beat this team and played well, but we dropped to 34. Well, that's one reason why. Or a great example of what can possibly happen is Purdue was my number 1 a couple days ago. Well, they dropped to number 3. You want to guess why? Because the
other 2 teams,
because the team
Arizona right?
No, actually, because the team that beat Purdue, Northwestern, got its ass handed to them by Illinois.
Oh, right. So their strength wasn't as good.
That brought in a brand new transitive comparison between Illinois and Purdue using Northwestern as the basis. And as a result, that was a huge positive for Illinois and a huge negative for Purdue. Now that happens, there's tens of thousands of those comparisons that go on behind the scenes every day. But that was one thing. The moment that happened in Northwestern plummeted, and all of a sudden that made that loss, that one loss for Purdue look that much worse. And that's why they dropped 2 spots.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's almost like a strength of schedule adjustment, right?
Right. And so that's where I'm like, when you said the question, does strength of schedule come into play? It does, but it comes out, with the wash, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's not something you factor in explicitly.
Yeah, so if a team gets worse, the fact that they played them even those 2 months ago, it hurts them in the current ranking.
Yep, and it does, even if it's 2 months ago, and that will hold less weighting. The performances that happened yesterday obviously will have a heavier weighting than something that happened.
And you should do that because of the injury factor. So you should definitely.
I think a game performance burns off roughly half of its weight in something like 35 days or something like that. I used to know this answer. I don't know what it is anymore, but I think it's something like that. Like half a game's performance's weight is burned off in like 30, 35 days or something like that.
You must have some massive equations in the background.
Oh my God. Yes. There are times when I look at the stuff that I've built years ago and when I had a lot more free time and I look at it, there are times I've looked at my own code and go, okay, so what was I doing here? Okay. All right. I see it now. And there's times I've questioned. I'm like, I think I'm wrong here. And then I look at it a little bit more. I'm like, oh, that's what I did. Oh, okay. Now it makes sense.
Totally. So, well, man, that's some great stuff, man, to talk about though. And I love it. But anyway, we got to get into a few games here anyway. Utah. Yeah. And I picked 3 games from this weekend, and maybe if you want to pick one, we can, or we can just do a quick hodgepodge. But Utah versus Arizona. I'm predicting Arizona is going to be around -9 points, and I just look at the efficiency sites to come up with that. I could be wrong, but I'm usually pretty close by averaging it up. The total is going to be pretty high at 163. So when you think about this team, Utah is actually playing ASU right now. They were just losing. It's about almost tied now. Utah's up 25-24. So, it's Utah away from home, I think, is a little bit different away from home. Arizona is coming off a nasty loss to Stanford, man. Just a despicable loss. So, what are your thoughts?
They're making up for it. They made up for it tonight. I don't know if you saw what they did to Colorado, but that was an absolute mugging. I was watching it before I came here, and I just see the score, and they took down Colorado by 47.
Okay,
and that's good. But oh my God, and Colorado's a pretty good team. But you're gonna watch Colorado tomorrow. I'm guessing they will not be as high as they are right now. They got thumped, and that's a team that was, again, a lot of people had some eyes on them, saying, they've really kind of climbed in the rankings based on their efficiency margins. Well,
I was looking at Arizona. I was wondering what this would look like today.
And Colorado, and Colorado's a very good team, but I watched them and they just looked just completely lost tonight, and that happens. I mean, we saw it with Arizona. I mean, they lost by 18 to Stanford. Now, granted, that was more Stanford shooting than anything else, but it happens. But anyways, getting back to the game, as I have it right now, I think I have Arizona by about 11.5. The over under on that's going to be about 166.5. I call it the 5 hair special. I talk about hares and tortoises. 5 hair special is good. You want a 5 hair special, or even better, a 6 hair special, which is talking about game pace. Now, this is going to be a pretty high octane game if it's 5 hair special, hence the over under of 166.5.
5 hairs right here, baby.
There it is, right there. With Arizona, my question was the same thing. Like, how much of a hangover would linger from that Stanford loss? Stanford shoots 16 of 25 from 3, so I can't really blame them from losing that game. Stanford's probably going to beat anybody shooting 16 of 25 from 3. But Arizona, they exceeded the analytical expectation in their first 8 games. They failed to meet the expectation in 3 of their last 5. It's going to be now 3 of 6 because I'm sure they blew the expectation out of the water for Colorado. But you talked about the home court advantage, and I think that's the playing at the McHale Center is a big factor there, not just for Arizona, but like you said, Utah. Utah is, I think, a team that you see a bigger discrepancy with certain teams where they really do well away from home, or really do well at home, and not so well away from home. You see a bigger, wider range, and I think Utah is one of those teams. Now, granted, Utah has overperformed. They started the year about 55th for me, now number 25 or so. They've won 8 in a row going into tonight. I think they just got to find a way to kind of limit Arizona's bigs. Umar Ballo, Keshad Johnson, Motias Krivas. Those guys are going to take advantage on the offensive board, and that's going to be a potential weakness for Utah. They got to find a way to stop that. But if you're looking at that game, and I right now, just because of Arizona at the McHale Center, I know that you threw a 9 number out there. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes closer to that 11 and a half, just because of how powerful Arizona has been at home, and people are going to ride that.
I was hoping. I mean, maybe it's wishful thinking. To be honest with you, I think where does Haslam has it at, or not Haslam? I think Ken Pom and Torvik have it at 9. So that's what I was kind of looking at. And then but you might be right. These are going to change, and now they're going to get a big bump for blowing out Colorado, which is a good team. And depending upon what Utah does to ASU, you're not. I mean, I'm hoping for under a 10 because I probably would have played Arizona just based upon some of the stuff you just said. Like, love looking at your site. Away from home, they're ranked 300th. Utah is a different team away from home, and then at home, Arizona ranks 18th. And I love that home road split mentality here. I think that's some of the things you have to look for when you're handicapping games, because not everybody looks for that, and most sites don't even show that. You have to literally look for that stuff yourself. The cheapest way to do it is look for, I guess, field goal percentage, offense, defense on something like team rankings, if you didn't have a Haslam metric. But this kind of calculates it all for you, which I really like. Arizona, I think, is only inconsistent because of some of their just weird losses and lack of defense. What I will say is, like, Carlson, Utah's got some tall guys themselves, that might be able to somewhat match up, but I don't think that they are big enough and strong enough to go against guys like Ballo either. I think even though it looks like their proximity defense is pretty good at Utah ranking 40th, the truth is, I think that could be a little bit more skewed based upon some of their schedule strengths as well. So I know they have a decent strength of schedule, 20th, but Arizona's is 7th. I would have considered laying it, but I think you're right. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be 11 or so. And, this pace, this total is going to be in the 160s. You wonder if you got the cojones to take something over that.
Well, you gotta think about a little bit of the regression back to the norm again. I mean, this was everybody talked about the regression back to the norm from the Stanford game. This is not the Arizona team that we expected. Well, tonight's kind of the same thing, but just in reverse. I mean, beating Colorado by that amount of 47 points is ridiculous. So,
right.
Is it going to be overblown? I mean, that's the thing. Sometimes I look and I have a good feeling. I'm shooting about 11 and a half out there for Arizona, and all of a sudden it wanders. And if it gets to 12 or 13 or something like that, then you start saying to yourself, okay, this is a Utah team who's getting a dozen points. And this is a good Utah team. Don't forget that.
Yeah, with Lovering, they have a couple 7-foot guys there.
Yeah. So if you're getting those points, and you're going into double digits with a good team, it's almost sometimes you almost kind of have to. It can really change. What I see on a daily basis is there's teams I'm like, I would expect this. I'm definitely going this route, and then all of a sudden I see the spread has wandered too far in one direction, and I've actually gone against the bet that I was originally going to go with. So it really depends on where it's going to wander. But if it ends up at like 11 and a half, that's going to feel about right to me.
That's probably going to be about right to me too, but it's going to be a great game to watch because of how well Utah has done so far. They're kind of the quiet team right now in the Pac-12, and you wonder if they kind of pick it up here coming up throughout the schedule. It's funny is like this is the last time you're going to see a Pac-12 schedule, so here you go. They're going to be changing everything, unfortunately, but some people's welcome it. Let's move on to the next game. And what did I pick here? I think I picked North Carolina versus Clemson. I have Clemson laying about a point to a point and a half. The total is 157. Now, we saw that big North Carolina win against an undefeated Oklahoma on a neutral court. I think it was in Charlotte, right? Mm-hmm. That happened. So you call that a semi-home court. But I think this is going to be interesting. I think North Carolina is definitely improved. It's weird how Caleb Love has left, yet they still are. They still got Bacot and a couple other guys, and Clemson has been very surprising this year. Now, I was against them yesterday at Miami. Lucky they were losing. Miami was losing at half, and then Clemson kind of went cold a little bit in the beginning of the second half, and that's how they won. But I got to say that Clemson, you have them ranked number 13 and number 15 here. Clemson 15, North Carolina 13. So do you see any matchup advantages here?
Yeah, Clemson, I got Clemson by about 3 in this one. Over under is 159 and a half. Clemson, like you hit the nail on the head. Really surprising team. Not really surprising, but they've exceeded the expectations. They have a top 10 offense, which is something I probably didn't see coming. They really shoot the 3-point well. The 3-pointer well. They're number 4 in the country for me in adjusted 3-point percentage. Joe Girard shoots 45%. He's a great get from Syracuse. PJ Hall has really upped his game. He's averaging 20 and 7 this year, up from 15 and 6 a year ago. But like you said, maybe they're going to come in here with a little chip on their shoulder, coming off a 13-point loss to Miami. Granted, again, the Canes shot 11 of 24 from 3-point range. So again, if teams are shooting that well, it's hard to beat them. Maybe a little bit of an Arizona kind of thing after they played Stanford, considering how Stanford shot the ball. Maybe the same situation here. But I do like North Carolina. I think they've won 3 in a row. All 3 of those games came back with positive game efficiency ratings. They beat Oklahoma on a neutral court. They won at Pittsburgh, both very good wins. They're balanced. They have a lot of ways to beat you. 4 guys are averaging over 11 points a game. More than adequate shooting, a big leap from last year. They really struggled shooting from distance last year. They finished the year adjusted 3-point percentage 260th at the end of last year. They're 26th right now. RJ Davis shooting almost 40%. Harrison Ingram, a great get, shooting 43%. I look at UNC right now, and I'm going to say this out here, hot take, but maybe they're that UConn kind of team. I'm going to say the UConn kind of team from last year, which is kind of in the high end of the pack, but under the radar. They have the depth, they have the shooting, they have the size. I don't know if you can kind of put Sonogo and Kling and match them up with Bacot and Washington. I don't know if Bacot and Washington quite reach that level, but I just something I'm watching right now of North Carolina that I think they could be a team that could be the chosen one for me. Now, right now, they're 15th in offensive efficiency, 27th in defensive efficiency. I think to be a national champion, you got to be top 10 offensive efficiency, top 35 defensive efficiency. They're already there defensively. They just need to climb up a few spots offensively, and then they have that fingerprint of a potential national champ.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's just tough because Clemson or North Carolina has performed away from home. I thought beating Pittsburgh the way they did handily was different from what they were the last few years. I know that they had hiccup against UConn, which is completely understandable. And then Kentucky was just a very close game on neutral courts. The Villanova one was a little bit more of a head scratcher, but the way they beat Tennessee, man, that was interesting. That looked like UConn a little bit when I look back at that Tennessee game at the end of November there. And then the way they manhandle Oklahoma. Now we don't know if Oklahoma's real or not. I might stay away from this game as well, but Clemson, on the other hand, has been shooting the three really well, ranking 11th in 3-point percentage. Their effective field goal percentage is in the top 20. So they're shooting really well, but their defense hasn't completely been well. It hasn't traveled well. I know they're going to be at home for this one. Probably going to be a fun game to watch, but I'm not sure if I'm going to pick a side here. For some reason, if North Carolina is favored on the road, then yeah, I would probably take Clemson. But
yeah, definitely. I think the same way. Even if Clemson is favored by 1.5, I might still go with them just because, I think Clemson is a really solid team. I think that Miami game is a little bit of a mirage based on how Miami shot the ball. Granted, they shoot well, but still. And then North Carolina, again, won 3 straight games, all positive game efficiency ratings. At some point, you're due for a little bit of a pullback. And North Carolina's got that target on them, just like any blue blood does. Clemson fans are going to show up for that game. They're going to be ready to go for that game. So, I'll be interested to see. And I think you're 1.5 pretty close. And I wouldn't be surprised if the spread actually does dip to the other side. If that happens, I'm probably with you. I'm probably climbing on Clemson.
Oh, me too, man. No, we'll find out. That's going to be a great game. Now let's move on to our alma mater, the Wisconsin Badgers, hosting the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And this is going to be interesting because Nebraska just had a massive win against Indiana. I don't know. Oh my God. I was watching that game and was it Mast hitting all those threes there? I can't remember who it was. I think it was Mast. No, it wasn't Mast. It was CJ Wilcher. That's who it was. It was CJ Wilcher hitting all those. It was just kind of the random 6'5" dude hitting all those threes. He's shooting like 50% from 3 of the last 15 games or something. I just saw some stat recently. He's been absolutely playing out of his mind, but you got to look at Nebraska and kind of take them somewhat seriously. I'm going to see a spread, and it's going to be like Wisconsin -8, Wisconsin -9, something like that, right? That's what I think is going to happen anyway. Maybe it'll be down to 7, but I think Nebraska deserves some respect in here at least. And I wouldn't want to lay a lot of points with Wisconsin. Now, on the other side of things, Wisconsin's shocking me a little bit, man. I didn't know that they would kind of run through Marquette, Michigan State, Virginia the way they did. Now, I know they lost early to Tennessee and Providence. And after they lost to Providence, I thought this was going to be one of those terrible seasons again. And all of a sudden they beat Virginia, SMU, Marquette, Michigan. I'm like, wow. That Arizona loss was ugly, and they just weren't going to catch Arizona in that game. Arizona could miss in that game. But, they had a really nice win against Iowa. I know Hepburn's have been a little bit beat up. Blackwell kind of came from nowhere, playing very well. AJ Storr transfers in, right? He's doing really well. Klesmit's playing a little bit better than he did last year. The person that's not playing well is Sejan. He's not even seeing a lot of playing time right now, which I find is strange. But Blackwell, the freshman, has really showed people that, holy cow, this guy's the 6th man, or maybe going to be a starter here really quick. I would say that I'm going to look at the under. There's a lot of efficiency sites that have this at 145, but I think that Nebraska is a little bit different on the road. According to your metrics, I'm sorry, not on the road. They were inconsistent, is what I want to say. They rank 358th in consistency, is what I'm trying to say. I think that inconsistency could either be, the high score that you saw last week, or last 2 nights ago, or it's going to be one of those lowest scoring Nebraska games. While Wisconsin still, how many turtle shells? You got 1 turtle shell here, but there's other sites that have them a little bit slower. Sometimes they will pick up the pace against the worst teams, but Big Ten play in general is a little bit lower and a little bit slower. I don't think Wisconsin wants to get in a foot race with the Nebraska team because they do very well in that. I think this could go under 145, but what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so the analytic expectation is Wisconsin actually only by 6. The over-under is pretty close to what you had. I think you showed 145 for me. I have 145.5, so it's going to be pretty close. You really hit the nail on the head. A lot of the comments I had with Wisconsin are, what we've seen. You touched on the Sejan. Sounds like he has a confidence issue. Sounds like he has a defense issue. That's why we're not seeing him out there. But you talked about how, they really got hot. Started with that Virginia game. They had 5 straight double-digit positive game efficiency ratings. And during that stretch, when you look at those wins, really great wins, Virginia, SMU's a very good team. Marquette's a very good team. Michigan State's in there. Those are great wins to have in your back pocket in March. The Arizona game, as you said, was ugly. But since then, they're playing largely around what you'd expect to see from a top 25 team. They're at the number 25 spot, not a top 5 team, but they're playing right around what you expect someone who's number 25, and that's where Wisconsin pretty much is for me. For Nebraska, this will be their third true road game. They've only played 2 road games up until now. One was a loss at Minnesota, and then they had the win at Kansas State, where they held Kansas State to 12 points in the second half. And this is a Nebraska team that is, again, trending upward. 4 out of their last 5 games, positive game efficiency ratings. They've won all 5 of those games, and they're looking at a 12-2 start. That's more wins than in 3 of their last 4 seasons, in completion, with the exception being last year where they won 16. But at this point, again, a lot of these teams like we're looking at here, like Wisconsin, Nebraska, I typically don't throw a lot of money on these games. What I end up doing, and I'll throw this out there as a little thing, is I kind of have a little side list that I create through the season where I have my covers and I have my fades. And I have kind of 3 different levels of like, I'm a little sure, I'm solidly sure, and then I'm all in on either a cover or a fade for these teams. A lot of and oftentimes, with the exception of a team like Michigan State, who I've been banging like hell to cover the last 3 games, and it's been paying off. Like Nebraska, Wisconsin, not showing up on my list, so it's probably something I'll lay off.
All right, fair enough. One thing I noticed, even looking at your site here, is Nebraska, they get some green against Wisconsin, especially from the 3-point percentage and from the near proximity. It's like I don't look at Nebraska as a good near proximity team now. Obviously, we'll see if that strength of schedule that only ranks 260th help that out a little bit. Sometimes it does, and you can't over adjust for strength of schedule. But that's kind of where I see a possible defensive game a little bit more than people think. Even though Nebraska likes to run a little bit, Wisconsin will pace it out if needed. So it's going to be a very interesting game coming up this weekend. But let's go on a hodgepodge here. It's funny you mentioned Oklahoma and Iowa State. Well, they play each other Saturday, so I love that. And your metrics have Iowa State winning this game at home, 74-2.
Actually, on the road. It's at Oklahoma. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, on the road. Yeah. Sometimes I see the top and they're at home on yours. I don't know why I said that this time.
Well, yeah. So I always put, and I've gotten people saying that before. They're like, "Well, how come you don't?" The order can change. I always say whoever is going to win the game is always on top, and then whoever's in bold is the home team. So
right. Okay, good call. And I should remember that because I actually did know that. I just got confused. But here we are. So you're at Oklahoma, but yet you think the spread might be a little bit towards Iowa State here. Iowa State, and this has been their thing from last year. They just are bad away from home. That's kind of what their mantra has been. And Oklahoma, playing a little bit out of their minds. I mean, who doesn't love Oklahoma's coach? Used to be at Buffalo and everything. And I just feel that Oklahoma had it, after that nasty loss, they kind of stepped back and, they beat Central Arkansas. It wasn't extremely, a tough game, but they won their next 2 games against them in Monmouth, but now they have to prove it against Iowa State. But Porter Moser, after what he did in Chicago there at Loyola, earn this spot, right? And I can see him getting these kids up for this game against Iowa State, but I don't know, man. This could be another one I stay away from, but I would lean Oklahoma just based upon Iowa State's bad home road splits.
Yeah, this is a classic example of 2 teams that we touched on earlier about having that weak strength of schedule. So we have no idea really at this point, these teams are kind of a mirror image of each other, potentially. In that we've only seen they're kind of a half face. We haven't seen the other half of their face. So we don't know which one of these teams is truly going to step up and which one's not. Based on the analytics, it's interesting that Oklahoma, even though they're at home, they're going to be a 2-point dog, at least from the analytical standpoint. I wouldn't be surprised one bit if that shows up flip-flopped when it opens and Oklahoma's a 2-point favorite. But hard to say, just because these teams have not really faced a lot of tough opposition. This is going to be a start of a gauntlet for them in the Big 12. I really shouldn't touch that. I'd be flipping a coin if you're asking me what's going to happen in this one, because I don't think anybody really has an idea what's going to happen, because we don't know who's for real and who's not.
Absolutely. I think Iowa State might be favored here. And so if that's the case, and if it's not down to a pick 'em, I'm going to take Oklahoma in this game just based upon their metrics and their I like the coaching on the Oklahoma side, and I just think that Iowa's a little bit worse away from home. So that's what I'll do in this situation. But I will say Iowa State has been amazing, especially on their fast break points. If Oklahoma doesn't clean that up, they they let the turnovers happen, they could absolutely lose that game as well. Erik, that's all the time we have, man. We covered a lot like we always do. I really appreciate your stuff and your great site. Where could our listeners and viewers get your great information?
Yep. So I'm out there right now. All my ratings, my rankings, my bracketology, my projections over at haslametrics.com. Otherwise, if you want to find me on Twitter or X, I'm out there going #analytically final. My handle is Haslametrics.
Make sure you follow Erik for college basketball and all the fun stuff he says on Twitter. Erik is a great follow and a good time. Thanks again, Erik. We'll be talking soon.
Thanks, buddy.